My name is Harold Shurtleff. I'm the New England coordinator for the John Birch Society. We want to welcome you to the program. I want to ask the viewers to get a note, some notebooks, pens and pencils, because there's going to be a lot of information that you may want to write down. And also, at the end of the program, there'll be a number that you may like to call to get additional information. The topic of this program is the Federal Reserve Bank. Now, many people out there have never really looked into it, and some of the information that you're going to hear tonight may be shocking. It may be even frightening. Well, we want you to understand that there is a solution to some of these terrible problems that we're facing, and so stay tuned for the solutions as well as understanding the problem. Our guest today is Mr. Ed Griffin. Mr. Griffin is the author of The Creature of Jekyll Island, which is here on the table. Mr. Griffin is a writer and documentary film producer with many successful titles to his credit. Listed in Who's Who in America, he is well known because of his unique talent for researching difficult topics and presenting them in clear terms that all can understand. Mr. Griffin is a graduate of the University of Michigan, where he majored in speech and communications. He is a contributing editor to the New American Magazine and is president of American Media, a publishing video production company in Southern California. Mr. Griffin, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much, Harold. I'm glad to be here.
The title of the book reminds me of a Stephen King novel, The Creature from Jekyll Island. What exactly is Jekyll Island? What or where is Jekyll Island?
Right. Well, obviously, this is a documentary, and so we're not talking about a sequel to Jurassic Park or something like that. We're talking about a place where the Federal Reserve System was actually conceived back in 1910. And it's a real island. It's off the coast of Georgia. And back in 1910, when the action began on this story, the island was completely owned by a small group of New York millionaires, the families of these millionaires. Such names as J.P. Morgan and William Rockefeller. The island was called the Jekyll Island Club, and this is where the families of the super wealthy went to spend the winter months. And it's really fascinating regarding the fact that the Federal Reserve System was actually conceived at a highly secret meeting that took place on that island in 1910. And the key to understanding the Fed today is the secrecy that surrounded that meeting, because normally there's no need to have a meeting in secrecy unless there's something that you want to hide. And so anyway, if you'd like me, I could tell you that story because it's a good lead-in to what's in this book.
Well, I think that before you do that, what is the Federal Reserve Bank?
Well, first of all, it's not a bank, and this is an interesting thing. Federal Reserve System, or bank as it's sometimes called, is not federal, which means it has nothing to do with the federal government, which comes as a big surprise to people. There are no reserves of any kind, real reserves, and it's not a system in the sense that it's a decentralization of power, which is the word, what that word was supposed to convey when they used it. And it's not even a bank, you know. So what is it? Well, Federal Reserve System is a corporation, and it was chartered by Congress with the Federal Reserve Act in 1913. And it's a corporation which was given the franchise, the exclusive franchise to create the nation's money. And as I said before, the federal government really doesn't run it.
So it's not a federal, it's not a reserve, and it's not a bank.
That's right.
Even though there may be 12 branches around the country, these are just a facade, actually?
Well, close to it. They do form a certain technical function for clearing checks and moving money around. But the power of the Federal Reserve System has always remained in the National Board, which is headquartered in Washington. And the power of the system, as far as the Open Market Committee and the decisions involving day-to-day operations of the Fed, really still remains in the New York so-called branch of the system, but it's more than just a branch. That's the component of the system which holds the power today.
Now, the president does appoint some Federal Reserve officials, so this may give the appearance that maybe it is indeed part of the government.
Yes, the president has the authority to appoint the national members of the board and the chairman of the board, so there is some indirect political influence there. And Congress, of course, can change the rules by which the Federal Reserve operates. They can amend the charter, and if they really wanted to, they could abolish the Fed. So there is some indirect political influence. But in reality, as it operates on a day-to-day basis, it has complete autonomy, just like the Supreme Court would.
Well, let's get back to, now that we have got a little understanding of what the Federal Reserve is, let's get back to Jekyll Island and what went on there. Why the secrecy? And why doesn't the average American know this? Because of its profound impact on this country. It should be in every single textbook, every history book in the country. When I was going to high school, junior high school, I heard about a Federal Reserve Bank, but that's all I knew. I knew nothing about this Jekyll Island. So,
right. Well, you weren't supposed to know about it, really, because when I also went to school, I didn't learn any of this. It was only when I got into the research phase of it, and then I realized that there's a lot going on out there that doesn't meet the eye, you know. And by the way, none of this is really that hard to find. It's in the public record if you're willing to dig for it. You can find most of this information in your major public libraries. But in any event, here's the story. It was 1910, which remember is about 3 years before the Federal Reserve System was actually passed into law. So this is a 3-year jump on it. And it was in that year that a group of 7 very powerful financiers gathered in secret at Jekyll Island to create the concept of the Federal Reserve System. And every one of these concepts eventually was embodied in the Federal Reserve Act. And the way they gathered is really interesting. Here's what happened. It was November of 1910 when Senator Nelson Aldrich, who was the Republican whip in the Senate at that time, sent his private railroad car to the New Jersey Railroad Station. And he and 6 of these others gathered there to get on that car and travel southward to Georgia, to Jekyll Island. And those 7 men had been told to come very secretly, not to be seen together, not to talk to each other, to shun newspaper reporters if they ran into them, and they all would have been recognized by any newspaper reporter had they
these
been
were
spotted.
some very prominent
Oh,
people.
very prominent people, and if you like, I can give you their names in a moment. One of the attendees came carrying a shotgun in a traveling case, so if he had been asked where he was going, he could say that he was going duck hunting, you know. But the fact of the matter is that man had never fired a gun in his life, you know, part of the deception. And when they got on board this private railroad car, they were told to use their first names only, not to use their full names. In fact, a couple of these people abandoned their first names completely and used code names to talk to each other. And the reason for that is that they were concerned that the servants on the train crew would recognize them and that they might talk and then the word would get out and the secrecy would be exposed. Well, they traveled southward, a 1,000-mile journey in this car. They wound up in Brunswick, Georgia. They took the ferry across the inland straits and they wound up at the Jekyll Island Club. Now, I went to Jekyll Island just recently when I came back here on the East Coast to check it out, and I thought since I was supposed to be an expert on this topic, I ought to at least see Jekyll Island. And it looks exactly like I thought it would from reading the record. There was a very elaborate clubhouse there, very luxurious, and it's still there, by the way. It's been restored by the state of Georgia. And there are a lot of buildings there, what they called cottages, where some of these families had built their summer homes. Well, they didn't look like cottages to me. They were mansions, magnificent, magnificent homes. But in any event, at this time of this meeting, the island was empty because that was November and the season started in January, so there were just a few maintenance people there. It was an ideal place to have a confidential meeting. So these 7 men went to the clubhouse, and for 9 days they sat around a table and they debated, they argued, they spoke, they compared notes, and they drafted the essential form of what became the Federal Reserve System. Then they came back to New York and they disappeared back into Wall Street, and for quite a few years afterward they denied that such a meeting took place. And then later, as it became known that some of them had been there, they said, well, yes, but we just gathered to talk about banking matters and play cards and that kind of thing. And then eventually, after the Federal Reserve System was firmly established and everybody revered it as an American institution, then they began to speak openly about the meeting and what happened and what they did. They wrote books on the topic. Some of them wrote magazine articles, and they gave interviews to newspaper reporters. And at this late date, we're able to piece together that story. Well, why the secrecy? As you just asked a moment ago. There was a very good reason for it. At the time, 1910 through 1913, there was a great concern among the American people over the concentration of wealth into the hands of a very few families, and furthermore, they were concerned over the concentration of financial power into the hands of a few investment firms on Wall Street. They called that group the Money Trust at the time. And so there was a hue and cry in Congress for legislation to break the grip of the money trust over the nation's markets. Well, the bill that was offered to break the grip of the money trust, as we see, was written by the money trust.
By the money trust.
So you see what a scam it was. Had this been known that these were the men that were drafting the so-called reform legislation, why then no one would have accepted their bill.
It would have been dead before it even got
dead
to
on
Congress.
arrival, absolutely. So that was the basic need for the secrecy. There were other things involved. I don't know whether I should get into that first. Would you like to know who was at that meeting?
I think a few names would be. I think.
I'm dying to
important.
tell you, actually, because what I'm saying sounds so far-fetched that without a little bit of documentation, it would be literally unbelievable. Now, we know who those men are now, because they admitted it. In fact, they boasted about it in later years. There were 7 of them. The first one I mentioned was Senator Nelson Aldrich.
That sounds familiar.
That sounds familiar?
Very familiar, yes.
The name Aldrich? Sure.
Yeah.
Remember Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller?
Rockefeller, yes.
Okay, that's the family tie. Senator Aldrich was the chairman of the National Monetary Commission, which was the committee created by Congress for the purpose of proposing reform legislation for the purposes I just mentioned.
So basically his job was to make sure these guys, to keep them in line, ostensibly.
Well, yes, that's like asking the wolf to build the defense around the chicken coop.
Yes.
Anyway, he was in charge of the National Monetary Commission. He was a business associate of J.P. Morgan. He was the father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller, Jr., which means that eventually he became the grandfather of Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, who became our vice president. Okay, he was the first one there. Then there was Abraham Piatt Andrew, who at that time was the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. Frank Vanderlip was there. He was the president of the National City Bank of New York, which at that time was the largest of all the banks in the country, the largest one in New York, the most powerful banking institution, literally, that there was anywhere in the country. And he represented the financial interests of William Rockefeller and Kuhn Loeb and Company. Okay? Henry Davison was there. He was the senior partner of J.P. Morgan Company. Okay? Charles Norton was present. He was the president of the First National Bank of New York, another one of the giants. Benjamin Strong was present. He was head of J.P. Morgan's Bankers Trust Company. And incidentally, he later became the first head of the Federal Reserve System 3 years later. And finally, there was a fellow by the name of Paul Warburg, very interesting character. He was born in Germany, later became a naturalized American citizen. He was a partner in Kuhn Loeb and Company. He represented the Rothschild banking dynasty in England and in France. And his brother was Max Warburg, who was the head of the Warburg Banking Consortium in Germany and the Netherlands. Paul Warburg was one of the wealthiest men in the entire world. And for those people who are Little Orphan Annie fans, they may remember that in that cartoon strip there was a character called Daddy Warbucks. Well, Paul Warburg was the real Daddy Warbucks, after whom that caricature was named. And I have a picture of Warburg in my book, and if you want to compare his photograph to the drawing of Daddy Warbucks, you can see quite a similarity.
So these folks weren't just bank tellers.
No,
We're
they
talking
weren't bank
about
tellers.
perhaps 1/4 of the world's wealth was represented at that little meeting there.
That's right. 1/4 of the wealth of the entire world. was
incredible.
represented by these 7 men. This was, in fact, the money trust.
That's incredible. Now, why did they establish a Federal Reserve Bank? Things were going pretty well. We had a pretty growing economy before then. So why was there a need to even establish one?
Well, that's right to the point, Harold, because it's easy to see why if the bankers are the big bankers now, we're talking about the mega banks, not the little banks, because the little banks are the ones that are getting squeezed out by this whole process. It's easy to understand why they would want to write their own reform legislation in order to deflect it so that it might not affect them. But they had something else in mind, and when you look at that list of men who were there, there's something really interesting about it. Here we had the Rockefellers, we had J.P. Morgan, we had the Warburgs, Kuhn Loeb and Company, the Rothschilds. You know, these were all competitors. Well, when competitors get together and come to an agreement, you better have a lot of coffee in you, because you better be on your toes. There's something going down here. What is it? Well, to answer your question very succinctly, it's a cartel. A cartel was being formed. The Federal Reserve System is a cartel, a banking cartel, and that was created on Jekyll Island, and the Federal Reserve Act is the cartel agreement, which was enforceable now by law. Now, a cartel is a grouping of independent businesses which come together for the purpose of reducing or eliminating competition between themselves to enhance their profits. And they do this by fixing prices or dividing up market share or agreeing that this member of the cartel will produce that product and somebody else will produce another one and they won't compete, or services of this kind. Dividing it up, avoiding competition so they can charge more for their products and services. Of course, the other side of that coin is that the public winds up paying more for those products and services. And banking cartels are no different than any other kind.
Like the oil cartel that we knew so much about during the so-called energy crisis of the 70s.
Exactly.
The evil Arabs. But here we have a cartel that's probably more powerful and influential.
That's right. So the reality is that the Federal Reserve System is the embodiment of a banking cartel that was hammered together as early as 1910 in secret at this meeting on Jekyll Island.
Now, if you read a textbook, I went to college, I took economics, and we said, what I learned was that the capitalist system really can't work by itself, and these greedy, evil bankers need to be kept in check. So to protect the people, we need a Federal Reserve System. But in reality, it was the same people who were behind this, running the banks, that wanted this to protect their own interests.
That's right.
And we see examples like that today in politics. We see that all the time. One party proposes something, the other party will hoot and holler, and next thing you know, they propose a very similar measure.
But they're the moderates, and they're
moderate.
Yeah, they're rushing toward totalitarianism at a slower pace, so therefore they're the good guys.
For example, if there's a $100 billion foreign aid package that, let's say, the Democrats, the Republicans say, that's ridiculous. $50 billion sounds pretty reasonable.
Yeah, right.
And within 2 or 3 years, you've got the $100 billion package after all.
Right. Well, I'd like to comment on that, Harold, because this business of blaming capitalism for all of the ills of the financial markets is a very deceitful thing. I learned the same thing, and it was very confusing to me. What